In Oxford for a Newsnight special.
Stop the Oxford Animal Lab!
This is the most controversial building site in Europe. When it's finished, they'll conduct experiments on animals here. Why? Should they be stopped? And if so, how? Welcome to Oxford Town Hall and a unique television event. Good evening. Those for and against experimentation on animals, men and women who sometimes have only traded abuse with each other, will tonight trade arguments in a special edition of Newsnight. We'll also have time for a roundup of tonight's main news, including that from the Middle East, but most of our programme will come from here in Oxford. Mel Broughton is a hero to some animal rights activists, but a criminal in the eyes of the law. In 1998, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit arson as part of his campaign. Now he says he's given up violence, but is spearheading the protests against the Oxford laboratory. When the building is ready, this man, Tipu Aziz, will use it to conduct experiments, including the most controversial of all, on primates, our closest animal relatives, in the hope of understanding and curing terrible human conditions like Parkinson's disease. Well, helping guide us through this scientific and ethical minefield, we're joined by many of the most eminent people in the field. Among them, Colin Blakemore of the Medical Research Council and Professor Claude Reiss, who has travelled from France to explain why he is against animal testing. Plus, Mike Robbins, who is a Parkinson's sufferer, all in front of an invited audience of local people from here in the Oxford area. In a moment, we'll hear why the Oxford Lab is so important to both sides. First, our specially commissioned Newsnight poll, and some of the findings will probably surprise you. When asked by Newsnight, is it acceptable to use animals for medical research, a significant majority, 58%, said it was acceptable. 40% said it was not. But for those building the Oxford laboratory, the findings are not quite so clear-cut. When we asked, should taxpayers' money be used to build more laboratories for animal testing, this time the figures were reversed. This time only 40% thought taxpayers' money should be used, but many more, 57%, said it should not. Well, we'll have more facts and shed more light on public opinion as the programme progresses. But now Liz McKean reports on why the Oxford Research Lab has become ground zero for this debate.
Stop the Oxford Animal Lab! 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 Stop!
They work at one of this country's most venerated universities. Yet these builders daren't show their faces. They labour behind metal screens topped with razor wire. It's part of a range of extraordinary security measures taken by Oxford University to ensure its new animal research centre is built in the teeth of furious opposition.
Stop the Oxford Animal Lab! Stop the Oxford Animal Lab!
The protesters are buoyed by recent success.
Stop the Oxford Animal Lab! Stop the Oxford Animal Lab! Stop the Oxford...
They managed to get work halted for more than a year after the original contractor apparently tired of the struggle. The identity of their replacement is a closely guarded secret. As the costs of the centre escalate, the university is striking back. The protesters are bound by a strict injunction taken out by the university. They're allowed to hold a demonstration for just 4 hours once a week. If at any other time they step inside this red line, they risk arrest.
Welcome to Warwickshire.
A security blanket thrown around the workforce includes where they live. They're bussed through the Oxfordshire countryside daily and anonymously. Some of the workers were followed from Oxford to here, the Fire Service College, deep in the Cotswolds. They're effectively being billeted and protected while they work on the Oxford laboratory. Animal rights protesters held demonstrations here too, until they were stopped by the injunction.
When you take on the animal liberation movement, businesses have learned we are a nightmare to take on once we get our teeth into something. We don't stop the vivisectors know us very well, but any new building contractor that's contemplating taking on this project, they want to do their research into what happens with other building contractors.
Is it acceptable to break the law in the name of animal protection?
Well, when you say is it acceptable, you must put the background, you must put the level of suffering. And maybe you're never going to understand people like me, that animals are truly my brothers and sisters, and we're going to do what we can to protect them.
The animal rights movement is united by its cause, though individuals follow different campaigns. Occasionally, one draws them together. And now it's Oxford's turn. Police say the city is a focus for animal rights activists from all over the country. Even its quiet towpaths aren't spared. Last year, a boathouse was set on fire, causing £500,000 worth of damage, an action claimed by the Animal Liberation Front. The fire isn't the only reason why the university is taking security so seriously. More than 100 letters claiming to be from the ALF have been sent out to local businesses and individuals. Now, even though the police say they have no links whatsoever with the new animal lab, the letter warns them that if they don't cut their ties with the university, they too will become targets. The university says it isn't planning to extend its animal testing programme, it's merely housing it under one roof. Paul Bolam is a scientist who uses rats in his search for understanding into Parkinson's disease. He tells us that if he had a young family, he would stay silent, but he feels driven to speak out.
When we have people with Parkinson's disease come into the lab, it's very humbling to see these people who are desperate. And all the many other diseases, it brought me to the point where I was thinking, this is just ridiculous. Somebody has got to put the other argument forward. And I guess the final straw for me was when a friend of mine for 20 odd years in our local village, who has a building company, received a letter from the Animal Liberation Front threatening that if his company did anything for the university, this company would be trashed, as other companies had been done.
A 16-year-old schoolboy has led a counter-attack against the animal rights movement, urging people within the university to speak up for the use of animals in research. But as the debate has become more intense, other academics are also being drawn into the fray, those opposed to the new lab.
So my mother suffers from Parkinson's. She takes drugs that will have been tested on animals. She suffers awful side effects from them, side effects that would not have been evident from animals, that wouldn't have been able to tell us about those side effects.
Sharon Howe has even handed her degree back to the university. 20 staff and members of Oxford have joined her campaign to challenge the Animal Centre. Even in this bastion of free speech, they hadn't liked to speak out before.
The university is not a solid block of totally agreed opinion. I'm sorry, I wish it were, perhaps, but it isn't. But we are, that's the whole rhetoric that we're hearing, and it makes us feel as if we might even get ourselves into trouble from higher up if we come out and say we're not entirely in sympathy with the animal lab or with the injunctions.
So far, Oxford's been spared the nightmare at Huntingdon Life Sciences in Cambridgeshire, site of a long and bitter campaign. This is where police say the activists' tactics altered. Their aim now is to cause economic damage by striking at secondary targets.
We've had to have bomb-proofing done of the windows, anti-incendiary letter boxed so that you can capture any incendiary devices that might come in. I've got CCTV cameras to all aspects of the house.
This man's company had only the loosest of links with Huntingdon. It was enough for his family to bear the brunt of a campaign of hate.
One of the most distressing things was the day I was actually sitting in the garden and Special Branch phoned me to say, we're now aware that there are letters within a half-a-mile radius of your home saying that you're a paedophile and encouraging people to hound you out of your home.
The government is supporting the university, underwriting the extra security costs. These will keep mounting.
The campaign will be stepped up, we shall be reviewing our tactics, and it will be a full force campaign. We will not stop.
Is that a threat?
It's not a threat, it's a promise.
And it's a promise that is causing disquiet in Oxford and beyond. With the issue of animal testing more polarised than ever, the fight over the new centre will not be easily settled.
Mel Broughton, why are you so determined that this lab won't work?
There's two main reasons why SPEAK exists to fight this animal research centre. They are ethical and they are one based on science. Animals suffer. Let's be absolutely clear about this. Animals suffer terribly when they undergo experimentation at Oxford and elsewhere. The second issue is a scientific one. Are animals the best model for finding cures for human diseases? Animals are not people. They never have been, they never can be the best way of moving forward. We live in the 21st century, a time of massive technological advancement, and yet here we are still paying lip service to the past, when we have the technologies now available to us to do cutting-edge research that's going to benefit people. Now, there's also something else that people must be aware of. It's a national scandal that this government can be given something like £100 million, which was reported to Oxford University to underwrite this animal research centre, when the National Health Service is crying out for money, when researchers that are doing cutting-edge research that will benefit human beings are crying out for money.
We'll come back to many of those arguments in just a moment. Tipu Aziz, why are you so determined? Why is it so important, from your perspective, that this lab should work?
Well, you see, I'm a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist. Improving the human condition is my primary concern. And towards that, I operate in theaters and do research experiments with Professor John Stein here, my colleague, in the primate laboratory. I transfer the conclusions of my animal research to man, and the benefits we see on a weekly basis are miraculous.
Are you, just in terms of the flavour of this campaign and the tactics, are you personally frightened? Have you found frightening things happening?
It's not a question of fright. If one were frightened of the consequences, this campaign of misinformation and fear would continue across this country and paralyze research. I will not let that happen.
Okay. Well, the first core issue in this debate is, as Mel Broughton suggested, does it actually work? We've had very many questions from viewers asking precisely this, whether animal testing really advances science in a way that nothing else can. Are there alternatives to using animals that could be fully explored? Last year, 2.9 million tests on animals were started in the UK. That's a rise of 7% over the past 5 years. It compares with the roughly 1,000 million animals used for food in the UK each year. Currently, the government spends more money on animal testing than on alternatives, though it's difficult to give precise figures. To take one example, the government's National Centre for Developing Alternatives received £1 million last year, whereas £11 million was given to boost training in animal research in 4 universities. Strikingly, our poll shows that only 4% of those asked believe that most of the money available should be spent on animal testing. Many more, 58%, want to see most of the money being spent on alternative testing, while 32% favour an equal split. Tipu Aziz, can we begin with Mel Broughton's point that it is 2006, surely there must be a better way? Do you think there is no alternative in some conditions, in some experiments, you have to do them on animals?
Yes, absolutely. It is a condition of getting the grant money to do research to prove that there is no alternative to the use of animals. So if a project could be done using computer modeling or tissue testing, no ethics committee or the Home Office would allow us to use animals.
Mel Broughton, do you accept there is, in some cases, it's not many, but in some cases, there is absolutely a medical need to do it? If you don't test it on animals, you can't test it properly.
No, I don't. No, I think, as I said at the start of this, you know, we now have the technologies available. It isn't a case that one technology, it isn't a case that one single technology is going to replace animals. We have a raft of technologies available to us now, used in conjunction, can offer a safe way of doing research that is actually beneficial to human beings, that relate to human beings. Animals are not people. You know, we are now living in an age where we do research on a cellular level, subatomic level, and animals never, you know, they physiologically differ from human beings in so many fundamental
ways. So you
ways.
say it's useless doing it on animals?
What I'm saying is that we now have a chance to move forward with medical research in a way that's going to benefit people, and that must necessitate us abandoning the animal model.
Tipu Aziz, it's people that you have to test it on in the end.
Those comments are basically based on rank ignorance. with no knowledge of the fact that every medical therapy we have today, both for man and animal, has its provenance in animal research. Many of the future drugs, diseases that will be defeated by us will come out of animal research.
I want to bring in Mike Robbins here, who's one of Professor Aziz's patients and suffers from Parkinson's disease. Mike, why is animal testing important to you?
Well, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's about 10 years ago, and the overwhelming majority, it appeared to me, judging by what neurologists said to me, was that my symptoms could be controlled by drugs. I took a whole raft of drugs in various combinations, and all drugs gave me horrible side effects, but no drug worked. I was told there was, at the last resort, there was a new state-of-the-art procedure known as deep brain stimulation. Now, I had deteriorated over that 2.5 years to become, I was absolutely marginalized. I would sit at home, I would just sit in the chair watching TV all day long, terrified, anxiety, blackness, depression. I couldn't, it was just, I was absolutely beside myself, together with a very, very bad tremor, which made me spill things, which upset the family, which made my life absolutely unbearable. And I looked at this and realized before the operation that there had been some research on the worst of animals, that is primates, in order to get to where we were with this procedure.
But you have taken that procedure and you're very grateful for it, and you have no regrets?
Well, if I control myself. No. I have a right-sided tremor. And this is what I was like from the moment I woke in the morning to the time I fell asleep at night. So I can't honestly say to you that I have to accept that.
I just want to bring in Mel Broughton that. Can you look him in the eye and tell him he shouldn't have that treatment because it was tested on animals?
I think I can look him in the eye and say that, that a lot of the research that was done into Parkinson's disease early on that led to things that that our friend here has developed from were actually first discovered in human beings, where people looked at the condition in human beings. It was only later on that
you can't, to answer my question, you cannot look him in the eye and say you should not have that treatment because it was
I'm not
tested
saying
on
anyone
animals.
shouldn't have a treatment. What I'm saying is that I think it's a complete misunderstanding of the facts to say that animal research is responsible for everything that people. That simply isn't the case.
To be honest, is animal research responsible for that treatment and that amazing difference that we've just seen there in Mike's case?
Absolutely, because the wires are implanted in a target in his brain that prior to understanding Parkinson's using the primate model, we never associated with the condition.
Let me bring in Sharon Howe, because we heard from you in the film, Sharon, a bit there. Your mother, as I understand it, has Parkinson's disease, and you are against animal testing. Can you explain why?
Because animals and humans are just so different. And we can't extrapolate from one species to the other. For, neurological diseases like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's, are diseases that animals don't get. Only humans get those diseases.
Forgive me, but we've just heard that you can extrapolate in some ways, and Mike has been suggesting that his treatment was, as it were, researched on animals. That's why he has the benefits that you can see.
We don't know that it might have been developed without animals. We're not putting enough resources and we're not investing enough in human-based techniques. We saw earlier on the statistics that a derisory amount is being spent on alternatives. And we want something, we don't just want alternatives, we want superior medicine, we want better. I want something better for my mother.
Let me just bring in Colin Blakemore there for the Medical Research Council. Do you accept that not enough research is done on alternatives? And do you also accept that this procedure could be proven some other way?
The Medical Research Council is the biggest public funder of research on alternatives, but about a quarter of our expenditure is on projects that involve some animal research. The philosophy of the Medical Research Council and of virtually every funder of medical research in this country, including the medical charities, is that, of course, the best route to a possible understanding and to treatments and to cures has to be the one that's selected. At the moment, unfortunately, the use of animals is the best route in most cases.
Unfortunately, it's the best. Claude Reiss, if I could bring you in, are there always, in your view, alternatives to this or not? Because as lay people, this is the thing we find very difficult to understand. We need scientists to sort this out for us, and there is some division. What's your perspective?
Yes, first of all, I would like to stress that there is no such thing as an animal model. That is, you cannot have any species which can behave as an animal model for another species. This is a clear demonstration for that. What defines a species? It's the impossibility to reproduce with other species, the isolation, reproductive isolation, see? Now, this is linked to the fact that the chromosomes, the genetic outfit of a given species, is unique. Now, the genetic outfit controls all the biological activities of a given species. So two individuals from two different species have different activities, so they respond differently. And I would like just to stress concerning Professor Aziz, that the technique he uses to cure his patients has been developed at least 15 years before he was doing the first experiment in this case.
Right. Can I just make sure I understand you correctly? You have no moral objection to experiments on animals, you just have a practical one. You just think they're a waste of time.
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that Professor Reiss has kindly misrepresented my work in that deep brain stimulation, neither I nor any of my colleagues today would claim to have invented it. It is on the basis of animal research that we find new targets to apply this technology to. And it is only through primate research that we could have allowed or gone forward to take patients such as Mike and given him the benefits that he has gained. And let me put it in perspective. To achieve the conclusions that have allowed Mike to have his surgery, across the world, perhaps in total 150 monkeys were used worldwide.
150 monkeys?
Yes, and I certainly was involved in those early stages. Today, 40 to 50,000 patients have had the surgery that Mike had.
Right. Well, Gill Langley, I mean, weighing that up in the balance, many people would say 150 monkeys, we don't want anything to happen to the monkeys, but actually that is a very good deal for humankind that those monkeys were experimented on.
I think we should broaden this debate out a little bit and not just look at one medical condition. The government in this country has acknowledged that non-animal replacement methods are advanced techniques that are generally cheaper, more cost-efficient and more reliable than animal experiments. And that is a quote.
Colin Blakemore says he's paying for it. They're absolutely behind it.
My organisation, the Dr. Hadwin Trust, has been funding nothing but non-animal research techniques for 36 years. And I think we feel that whatever the views people have and the arguments people have about how this or that medical technique developed in the past, what we want to see is a change in the way research is done now and the way research is done in the future. It must become more humane. It can become more effective by developing replacement methods, and every funding body and every scientist has a responsibility to forward that initiative.
Okay, I do want to widen the debate now, because one increasingly important part of all this is the moral or philosophical dimension. What rights do animals actually have? Many viewers, again, wrote in asking if testing, even if it's effective, should it be banned just because animals suffer? And what difference does it make if the animal in question is a chimpanzee or a rat? As we mentioned at the beginning of the programme, our poll shows a significant majority, 58%, who believe it is acceptable to use animals for medical research. But there's a gender divide. 67% of men are in favour of testing, but only 49% of women. There are differences too on the types of animals used. Last year, the vast majority of tests, 85%, were carried out on mice, rats and other rodents. Tests on dogs, cats, horses and non-human primates numbered 12,800 in total. That amounts to a tiny part, less than 1% of all testing. Then our poll described specific tests and asked what people thought of them. 43% thought that giving a mouse a daily dose of a chemical substance throughout its lifetime to see if it develops cancer was acceptable. Among men, that figure rose to 52%. But when it came to surgery on a dog to make it incontinent, only 16% of those asked felt that should be allowed. Perhaps surprisingly, when we asked whether brain surgery on a gorilla to produce a stroke should be permitted, a procedure which is actually banned, 19%, roughly 1 in 5 people, said the experiment should be allowed. Mel Broughton, just on the ethics of this now, if an animal experiment could help save a child, would that make it moral in your view?
No.
Absolutely not, no matter what the animal is?
No, it wouldn't make it moral.
If the experiment were on a mosquito to help with malaria, you shouldn't do it?
I think we have to move towards a situation where animals are completely taken out of the equation for the reasons we already talked about scientific.
Yeah, but you're answering the previous questions, which is, does it work? But I'm asking you, morally, would you experiment on a mosquito to save...
If we can show that scientifically it doesn't work, then we shouldn't be doing it anyway, and the moral question's already answered. But I think we have to move to a situation where our moral compass changes. I think, you know, we live in times when most people understand that animals are capable of suffering. Not just physical pain, but psychologically as well.
Forgive me, Mel, but you know, we'll talk about the cuddly animals in a moment.
Well, it's not a case of talking about cuddly
malaria
animals.
and a mosquito. Would you kill a malarial mosquito on your arm?
Would
you kill it?
No. If I could avoid doing it, no, I wouldn't, no.
You would not kill a malarial mosquito?
This seems a completely ridiculous argument to put forward in a debate about the Oxford lab. I mean, what we're talking about here, I mean, these hypothetical questions that really aren't going to move us any further forward.
Yes, sir.
It seems to me, I'm the local MP here, and public policy does impinge on this issue. Because I think that you can have a legitimate view, in my view, though I disagree with him, that animals shouldn't be used for human purposes. But what they don't do is campaign to close down every high street butcher, every farmer who farms animals, which only gives us a menu choice of meat as well. We don't have huge campaigns to get rid of rat poison or mouse traps. And what we're talking about here is research that saves lives. And that's why, because they can't make that moral point, that they rely on the pseudoscience we heard earlier that argues that somehow you can test pregnancy on test tubes. Test tubes don't get pregnant. You've got to test transplants on living organisms, because otherwise you cannot reproduce that. And everyone, all my political colleagues, recognise that if you could use an alternative, you should. But where there is no alternative, we must fund, using public money if necessary, research using animals to deal with the major diseases.
I just want to bring in Sophie Pettit-Zeman, who's next door to you. In terms of the medical research charities, do you find anyone says, I have moral objections to this, so therefore I wouldn't use the drugs or the treatment that are produced as a result of this?
Our organisation represents about 114 medical research charities. They fund research in universities and hospitals across the land, and they are all accepting of the fact that research using animals has been and continues to be an essential part of medical progress. They don't all fund it, but many of them do. And I think there's an important question to ask here, which is that we ask that the moral question, if you like, is it acceptable to use animals in research? Turn it the other way round and say, is it acceptable not to defend the right of researchers to use them if they're going to enable people like Tipu to help people like Mike? Right. Can I make one more point, which is that there seems to be a strange conflation in the anti-vivisection argument, which is that on the one hand, they say animals are so like us that it's morally wrong to use them. And by the way, if that argument doesn't convince you, we'll tell you that they're so different that the science doesn't hold up. Both arguments can't be true.
Well, on that point, Alistair Currie of the British Union... Alistair Currie from the British Union Against Vivisection. What do you make about that moral conflation point?
No, I think, in fact, that they have it the wrong way around. If you look at moral questions, the question is not... well, Jeremy Bentham put it perfectly hundreds of years ago. It's not can they talk, it's can they suffer. If an animal can suffer in the same way as we do, then it deserves the same right not to suffer as we do. And the key point is that the physical similarities, that's a question of fact, if you like, of whether or not you can transfer from one to another. And if that can't work or won't work, that's really irrelevant. But the question of suffering, if they have a right, a desire to live, to be free, and to avoid suffering, if we respect that in people, and we respect it in all people, whether they're intelligent, whether they're popular, whether they're good or bad, we recognise that they have a right not to have suffering inflicted upon them.
Do you accept it in all animals? That was the point I made originally. Do you accept it in chimpanzees? Presumably you would say yes. Do you also accept it in rats? Do you also accept it in mosquitoes?
But I think we have a real tendency that when there's a problem with animals, solve it by killing. I don't think we should solve any problems by violence, any problems by killing.
Now, you haven't quite answered my question. Do you say all animals, or absolutely all animals, including mosquitoes and snakes and so on? Yes?
Broadly, yes. To answer Mel's question, we all have a right to legitimate self-defense. Yes, Mel may differ to it from me, but I would slap a mosquito on my arm in order to save my life. That is not, as Mel rightly said, an appropriate analogy for what takes place when we conduct an experiment with no knowledge of the outcome, but we do know it's going to cause harm, suffering, and death. That's never right.
OK, I just wanted to bring in Eric Sigman, who's a psychologist, and I just wondered how far, when you hear what public taste is in these matters, what the public says, how far it's the cuddly animals that really offend us, that it is the chimpanzees and the dogs, that really does offend us. Rats and mice, we don't care so much about.
Yes, we have a selfish investment in terms of how emotional we become over animal testing. I think one of the frames of reference we could use to decide various moral issues involving animal testing is to compare cultures. And generally speaking, whether this is popular here tonight or not, most cultures have decided and have always thought that humans are more important than animals. Secondly, most cultures are very willing every minute of every day to exploit animals as they see fit. The means often justify the ends. As a basis gives you an idea of, I suppose, the dimensions of this argument, that one can say animals are equal, and the public also have some role to play. They have very high expectations in Britain now of cures, but no responsibility, no side effects, or they will sue. And you can see how we've gotten to where we are now.
Sharon Howe, on that point, that most cultures do, as we've just heard there, put animals on a different plane from the human animal.
I don't agree with that. And also I think that we are evolving morally. I mean, we've had a lot of successes in terms of improving things for animals. We've managed to ban cosmetics, and that just shows that as soon as we banned cosmetics, other techniques were developed. Other techniques will come in to fill the space. So I think it's to relate this to medical science. If we stop animal testing, there will be a lot more ingenuity, a lot more resources, a lot more investment put into alternative techniques.
Colin Blakemore on that point, that actually it's the cheap and lazy option to do the animal testing as well as the cruel one, is that argument?
Well, if you're suggesting that we should wait for the decades or the centuries that might be necessary to develop alternatives for present animal research that will produce benefits quickly, then I think that is an interesting debate. But the people who should be most involved in the debate are the people who are waiting for the cures that medical research is aiming to deliver. We've heard a great deal about suffering. I'm opposed to suffering. The mission of the Medical Research Council is to reduce suffering, the suffering of other people.
Mel Broughton? But in fact, Professor Blakemore conceded that in the long term, you may be right, there may be alternatives, but right now, for people suffering right now in the immediate future, there isn't.
No, I don't accept that. I think for far too long, we've been led to believe that without animals there could be no medical progress, and that simply isn't the case. And I think it's lazy thinking, and I think it's unforgivable that animal researchers at Oxford and elsewhere are actually saying to the public, look, unless you let us experiment on animals, you're all going to die. And I think that's a terrible emotional blackmail argument to use. And I think it's time that people woke up, and we did start realising that this is the 21st century, the technologies are available. All other areas of science are moving on, except when we get to vivisection, except when we get to animal research, and we keep getting the same old arguments. There can be no progress with animals. Of course there can be progress.
There can be progress with animals, Stephen.
Well, I'm not here to convince Mel Broughton. I'm here to educate the public. And what I would reassure the public is that all of medical therapy we have today, all that we have in the near future and beyond, will have to derive its as much as possible from animal research. There's no middle way about it.
Okay. Well, perhaps the most worrying thing about all this for many of us, as we saw in Liz McKean's report, is that it's led to intimidation and violence. Again, we've had a lot of emails on this subject. Scientists have been harassed and they've been attacked, their premises picketed, and there have been incidents of arson and terrorism.
Campaigners have been successful in getting a ban in the UK on the use of animals for testing cosmetics, tobacco and alcohol. But campaigning techniques have themselves become hugely controversial and disturbing. Over the past 2 years, animal rights extremists have been responsible for 229 attacks on people's homes. 262 incidents of damage to property, 9 incendiary devices, and 6 personal attacks. Although the first half of this year shows a halving of attacks on people's homes and damage to property, this may be because many of the people who have committed those crimes are currently in jail.
Keith Mann, as I understand it, you were jailed in 1992, 1994 and 2005 for crimes described as animal terrorism. In your view, does anything go? Do you have any regrets about what you've done?
Well, if I can correct a few points that you made, we haven't banned cosmetic testing. We haven't banned the testing of alcohol or tobacco in this country. I broke into a laboratory in 2003, which is what I was in prison for, and revealed that we're testing Botox in this country on animals. We're not giving mice a pill once a day. We're injecting it into the abdominal cavity of baby animals, 4-week-old animals. This is extreme violence. 10,000 people die in this country every year because they're given products by their GP that have been tested on animals and passed as safe. This is violence. People are dying. And we're talking about broken windows and paint stripper on cars. There are big issues here. 3 million animals suffer terribly in this country every year. 10,000 people die. And we're talking about acts of economic sabotage.
So the short answer to my question is no. You have no regrets, absolutely none.
I'll make my point again. 3 million animals are suffering terribly. We are a nation of animal lovers, and we're torturing to death 3 million animals every year.
I'll take that as a no. Colin Blakemore, you've been described as the scientist with the most threats against him in Britain. I don't know whether that's true, but what is the atmosphere like for you and other scientists?
Well, it has until recently. I think things are changing, been incredibly intimidating. But I think it's very hard to deny that part of the tactics of the extreme opposition has to prevent a contribution to this debate by scientists themselves, which is an essential part of the discussion.
What do you say, to shut you up, not to stop you?
Yes.
To shut you up?
Yes. And fortunately, I think we've seen a turning point in that respect. People like Tipu and many researchers in Oxford and elsewhere are much more willing to open their labs, to show the media and people exactly what goes on, and to contribute to this very important discussion.
Keith Mann, come back on that.
I am one of the worst extremists in this country, if you listen to what the media say. You know, I've never hurt anyone. The Animal Liberation Front has never hurt anyone. You know, I'll stress again, 10,000 people die in this country every year because they're given products that have been passed as safe.
Just on this point, you've caused fear. You've made people fearful of speaking in open debate.
What we want, all I want, this is the point I was trying to make, and same with anybody. This isn't a debate between animal rights extremists and scientists. There are a lot of eminent scientists in this room and on this side of the debate that want an open public debate, a proper inquiry, which we've never had into this whole area. We pour billions of pounds into this issue. The government, £100 million to build this one lab. No one's ever tested this theory.
Tipu Aziz, have you been frightened by this? It's something I suggested to you, or your researchers put off, or people not want to work for you?
Well, certainly people are unwilling to appear publicly in debates where I would be identified, but that is their personal choice. Yes, there is an element of fear. From my point of view, my belief in what I do and the results I see make it absolutely mandatory that I speak out. And certainly it's a stance that John Stein and I have had for more than 7 years.
I want to bring in Alistair Currie on this because you made it absolutely clear where you stand on the issue, but on the tactics. Would you explain to Keith Mann why you differ from him on the way he goes about things?
I do differ with Keith on this, and I think the majority of people within the animal rights movement do so. Firstly, I think that one of the principles, in my view, that guides us is a rejection of the notion of force. I entirely accept what he's saying, that there's a tendency to talk about violence and terrorism, which I think is unhelpful here. But acts of economic damage, acts of economic sabotage, I don't think they're helping to move this debate on or move it forward at the moment. The key way that we will achieve results here is to persuade scientific community, politicians, and overall the public to support us. And in order to do that, we have to demonstrate to them that we respect the rules that they respect.
Evan Harris, have tactics changed?
Well, tactics have changed, but I think the government and politicians of all persuasions have to do more to explain to the public why it's necessary, because there is no, although there are allegedly scientists on both sides, we have to make it absolutely clear that the huge overwhelming majority of scientists recognise that research using animals, not just testing, but finding the cause of disease in many cases and finding new animal testing techniques, the techniques have moved on, is essential when there is no as effective alternative. And what we have to do, I think, is start ensuring that the public opinion changes on some of those figures. For example, we have to, I think, tell people when they get a prescription or get a drug bottle that these drugs were only available because of research and testing done on animals. I think that will change public mood.
Okay, I just want to bring Keith Mann in one more time on this question of tactics, because if all the publicity that the animal rights movement gets is violence, harassment, doing damage, that blurs the whole issue for you, doesn't it? It presents you as a group of nutters.
That's the media doing it, but we wouldn't be having this debate if it wasn't for those groups of nutters. We wouldn't know about the duplication that's going on in laboratories in this country and about the extreme violence that's been inflicted on live animals if it wasn't for the extremists, because no one else is talking about it. We're the only people that are raising this issue. And can I just add one more point?
Go ahead, yeah.
240 MPs have signed an early day motion that's going through Parliament currently, requesting a proper debate, an inquiry into this whole area. That's massive. And I would suggest that our MP friend here hasn't signed that. And I do know that the protest group are contacting their MPs and asking them not to sign this petition. Why is that? What are they afraid of?
Why? I just want to bring in Ian Simpson finally, but those in favour of testing have been very slow off the mark to make any kind of case at all, haven't they?
Sorry, those in favour? Yes, I think for a long time people were afraid of moving off the mark, but I think part of that was actions of people like Keith and his pals, where if you speak up against and say you support animal research, they go around, they tell everyone on your street you're a paedophile, they send letters to your house saying we're going to get you. I mean, in terms of what we heard about there, about a proper independent inquiry, Keith, you know as well as I do, there have been 3 inquiries in the last 6 years. No, don't shake your head at me, I'll even name them for you. 2001, 2003, 2004. There have been lots of inquiries into this issue to suggest...
Just this lady here, yes, go ahead.
It's very, very important to point out here that it's absolutely logical to oppose animal testing and support medical testing. The two are not one and the same thing. Many, many scientists support animal testing and support medical testing, oppose animal research. Europeans for Medical Progress opposes animal testing because it's a huge obstacle to medical progress. Dr. Randall, Evan, you've had a lot of time. Evan, this is Dr. Randall Charlton, who directs the UK's biggest human tissue company, who could have predicted the Northwick Park clinical trial disaster where monkeys failed so abysmally.
On a tissue culture. It's a system. It isn't a tissue culture. So yes, it's good for some things, but you have an absolutist position. You have an absolutist position saying it can never work.
We have no absolutist position. The only way to settle this ever is to have a scientific evaluation. That's all we're asking for.
Okay. All right, ladies.
You would never accept the results. I would. You're absolutist.
Ladies.
Never accept the results.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take that applause as a cue to cue in our final thoughts from our 2 speakers here. Mel Broughton, briefly.
As far as I'm concerned, everything I've heard tonight has not changed my mind at all. I will be back in Oxford tomorrow and the day after. I'll continue fighting this for the reasons of both ethical and scientific, and it goes on.
Well, I see that my job is to increase more my public involvement in educating the public about how much their health owes animal research, and to correct this torrent of misinformation we've heard.
Okay, thank you all. That's all from us here in Oxford tonight. We'd like to thank our hosts here in Oxford Town Hall and also BBC Radio Oxford, plus our audience and all of those who took part, especially those of you who sent in emails and clearly feel very strongly on both sides of the issue. This may be just the beginning, who knows, of a national conversation on the issue. Now let's join Liz McKean in the Newsnight studio for the latest news. Good night.
Gavin, thank you.